Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast. Episode 2.5, The German Counterattack. We left off last time with intense street fighting raging throughout the city centre of Bautzen, as the attacking Soviet forces advanced slowly forward, tightening the screws on the remaining city garrison troops, who by now had been pushed back to the vicinity of the Ortenburg castle itself. But just as it looked as if Bautzen would fall to the Soviets, hope had been stirred for the defenders by the news of the impending German counterattack which, it was promised, would soon arrive in the city and rescue the beleaguered men of the garrison. The Soviet and Polish forces, meanwhile, had been caught off guard by the resurgent German counterattack, now threatening to completely disrupt their lines and endanger their entire campaign in Saxony. Bautzen had still not capitulated, and worse still, Soviet control over the key town of Weißenberg was hanging by a thread. Just a quick FYI that as we'll be diving into the German counterattack in detail in today's episode, I've posted a handy map in the episode description which will help you visualize the battlefield and follow along with the events we'll be covering. At dawn on the 22nd of April, the German 20th Panzer Division engaged Soviet anti-tank positions at Gebelzig, north of Weißenberg. Once these positions were defeated and the northern approaches to Weißenberg were secured by German forces, elements of the Brandenburg Division prepared for their advance on the town. This sudden German advance towards the town sent the Soviet command into a frenzy. General Korchagin of the 7th Guards Mechanized Corps withdrew more units from Bautzen, and he immediately created a mobile battle group comprised of the 57th Guards Armoured Brigade and the rest of the 25th Guards Mechanized Brigade, which were to be sent back east to support the 294th Rifle Division defending Weißenberg. To underlie the importance of holding the town at all costs, General Korchagin dispatched his young deputy, Major General Vladimir Maximov, to lead this relief force. And Maximov marched with around 2,000 men and 30 armoured vehicles back towards Weißenberg. Maximov's force was tasked with reinforcing Weißenberg, retaking supply routes which had been captured by the Germans, and restoring a connection between the Soviet and Polish vanguard forces around Bautzen and their rearguard units further east. The Polish 1st Armoured Corps was supposed to support Maximov's force, and Maximov himself believed that he would be met by Polish tanks outside of Weißenberg. But as communications between the Soviet and Polish forces had been cut, it's unlikely the Polish 1st Armoured Corps even received this order. By now, General Szyszewski had lost direct contact with Marshal Koniev, who, in the absence of news from the Polish Second Army, and increasingly concerned by the German counterattack, dispatched his Chief of Staff Ivan Petrov and Chief of Operations Vladimir Koslyev to Szyszewski's headquarters north of Bautzen to assist him and his Polish Second Army in stabilizing their lines. Szyszewski was ordered to move 2 brigades towards Diza and 2 brigades towards Bautzen. In response to this directive, Szyszewski ordered the remaining Polish 1st Armoured Corps units advancing towards Dresden to turn back around and head for Diza. The problem was, these armoured forces, who had just taken Radeberg 10 kilometres east of Dresden, were now more than 60 kilometres away from Diza. So this U-turn was certainly no quick undertaking. Szyszewski also ordered the 8th Infantry Division to break off its advance towards Dresden and head back east to strengthen the Polish lines from the German counterattacks. Whilst these deployments to strengthen the Polish flank against the German counterattack were welcome, Szyszewski was still fixated on the idea of his Polish troops capturing Dresden. So despite the desperate situation which was developing for the Polish and Soviet forces in Bautzen and Weißenberg, Szyszewski still ordered his 9th Infantry Division to continue their advance onto Dresden. Not only did this rob the Poles of a much-needed body of troops which could be used to stabilize the line further east, it also left the 9th Infantry Division completely isolated. Once again, Świerczewski was committing a calamitous mistake, and his character and suitability for his leadership role must be questioned. Following this latest error of judgment, the Soviet High Command decided it had had enough of Świerczewski, so Chief of Staff Ivan Petrov dismissed him, replacing him with Vladimir Koslyev instead. But by that point, the dismissed general had already sent his orders out into the field. Eventually, the Polish 9th Infantry Division's order to advance onto Dresden was rescinded, and they were ordered to also pull back and assist with the defense against the German counterattack. But given the poor state of communications on the battlefield, the constant back and forth of conflicting orders took time to be communicated to the commanders in the field, not to mention the chaos which was caused by the constantly changing orders. Ultimately, however, what the frantic redeployment of Polish and Soviet forces does show is that the German counterattack had seriously spooked the Red Army High Command. The tactical advantage had clearly been surrendered to the Germans, and the Soviet and Polish forces would now spend the rest of the battle on the defensive, fighting tooth and nail to hold what ground they had already taken, whilst trying desperately to avoid the encirclement and destruction of their vanguard forces. Recognizing that the entire Red Army operations in Saxony were under threat, and that reinforcements were urgently needed to prevent any German breakthrough which might threaten the assault on Berlin, Marshal Konev ordered a transfer of additional 1st Ukrainian Front forces to the front line in Saxony. This included units such as the 14th and 95th Guards Rifle Divisions and the 4th Guards Tank Division. Konev's orders were simple. The reinforcements should assist the Polish Second Army and the Soviet 52nd Army in establishing a new, strong defensive line in northern Saxony, which would prevent the Germans from breaking through northwards to reach Spremberg in southern Brandenburg. In another signal of Konev's increasing concern, he also ordered the Red Army Air Force to fly more sorties in Saxony in order to assist their ground forces there and to counter the surprisingly effective Luftwaffe presence. Whilst Konev rushed reinforcements to the front line in Saxony, General Korchagin also prepared to defend his Soviet forces in Bautzen from the impending German counterattack on the city. To protect the northern approaches to the city, the 26th Guards Mechanized Brigade was pulled out of Bautzen and ordered to take up defensive positions to the north of the city, between the villages of Berk and Pliskowitz, whilst other defensive positions were also established in the nearby villages of Niederkaine and Besankwitz. Likewise, elements of the 254th Rifle Division were deployed to block the eastern and western approaches to the city. Elements of the 24th Guards Mechanized Brigade were ordered to take up defensive positions near the village of Kupschutz, southeast of Bautzen. And lastly, extra reinforcements were sent to the village of Neupurschwitz, just outside of the airfield east of Bautzen. Here, they could overlook the main road from Weißenberg to Bautzen and warn the Soviet forces in the city when the Germans were coming their way. Whilst the Soviets prepared themselves for a German attack on Bautzen and Weißenberg, the Germans continued mopping up isolated Polish and Soviet forces throughout central and eastern Saxony. For instance, they pushed further towards the Schwarze Schupps River, towards the town of Boxberg, and to the west, they pressed their advance west of Diese, proceeding towards the town of Groß-Dublau. By the afternoon of the 22nd of April, General Maximov's relief force reached Weißenberg, where they linked up with the 294th Rifle Division. Maximov could see that Weißenberg was in imminent danger of being surrounded by the advancing German counterattack, so he dispatched units to attack and dislodge the Brandenburg Division stationed north of Weißenberg in the village of Gebelzig. The Germans were ready and waiting, however, and the attack was repelled. To make matters worse, German forces then arrived in the village of Würschen to the west of Weißenberg, threatening to cut the road between Bautzen and Weißenberg, stranding Maximov's forces from reinforcements. Realizing the danger, Maximov immediately dispatched a rifle regiment and a large number of tanks to beat back the Germans and keep the road open. The fighting was intense, but after 3 hours, the Soviets had lost over 100 men and 9 tanks. The shattered remnants of the rifle regiment and the tank unit were forced to retreat back to Weißenberg, and the Germans proceeded to cut the road. The German encirclement of Weißenberg was complete. Back in Bautzen, after the redeployment of units to the outskirts of the city in anticipation of the impending German counterattack, the amount of Soviet forces left within the city had been significantly reduced. By now, the only Soviet forces still stationed within Bautzen were the 933rd and 936th Rifle Regiment of the 254th Rifle Division, along with a reconnaissance company and the 1st and 3rd Motorized Rifle Battalions of the 24th Guards Mechanized Brigade. The truth was, these remaining Soviet forces lacked the numbers to fulfill the tasks which were being asked of them. Firstly, they were ordered to maintain the pressure on the remaining German garrison troops holding the Ortenburg Castle. The goal here was to still storm the castle and force the garrison to surrender. And secondly, they were also tasked with clearing out remaining pockets of German resistance throughout the rest of the city. This second task was easier said than done. For instance, a group of German soldiers were still holed up in the buildings of the city prison, and they continued to inflict heavy casualties on any Soviet troops who dared approach. This pocket was only flushed out and eliminated when the Soviets sent a tank crashing through the front door, followed by a wave of Soviet troops who rooted out the remaining German defenders in each wing by showering each room with machine gun fire and grenades. The attacks on the Ortenburg Castle continued throughout the day, with the situation for the German defenders only slightly helped by a partially successful Luftwaffe supply drop, which managed to drop 1/2 ton of urgently needed supplies and ammunition into the castle grounds. However, as welcome as these supplies were, the rapidly worsening weather conditions prevented any further drops from being attempted. The desperate scenes were later described by Manfred Stephan, the 16-year-old who was part of the troops defending the Ortenburg Castle. The cellars in the Ortenburg Castle were overcrowded, full of wounded German soldiers. They were lying there like sardines. If you went into the main building, there was a small open spot upon which there was a shaft of light. Many of the soldiers were defecating there. The toilets elsewhere were overflowing, and there was no more water anyway. I saw many dead, especially those who had lost their lives to shrapnel. There was also a radio operator with a radio. Outside, there was a car parked against the wall of the main building, and the engine was always running day and night. I assumed at the time that it must have been used to power the radio. By now, the only areas in the city still under German control were the castle, a few houses on the Berglane Street just outside the castle grounds, or isolated German holdouts, such as on the Schützenplatz. But just as it seemed Bautzen would finally fall to the Soviets, a German spotter positioned in one of the highest towers of the Ortenburg Castle observed some strange developments from beyond the outer districts. And what he reported gave heart to the castle defenders. The spotter could see that outside of the city, the Polish and Soviet forces were frantically repositioning their troops, and that there seemed to be a sense of chaos within those forces. Something was clearly happening, and soon afterwards, the Soviet 26th Guards Mechanized Brigade, who had just finished repositioning themselves into defensive positions north of the city, were suddenly attacked by the German 20th Panzer Division, who sent an infantry regiment and 60 tanks at the Soviets. The German assault to relieve Bautzen had begun. Facing this sudden wave of German troops and tanks, the 26th Guards Mechanized Brigade was instantly pushed back, and they retreated to the Kopacz Hill near Doberschütz, north of Bautzen. The German vanguard pressed on and moved southwards to attack the Soviet forces within the city itself. Meanwhile, to the south of Bautzen, the 1st Hermann Göring Division was preparing its own assault on the city. At the headquarters of the 7th Guards Mechanized Corps, located on the eastern outskirts of Bautzen, General Korchagin was observing the fighting in the city. Suddenly, he saw the German tanks belonging to the 1st Hermann Göring Division silhouetted against the sky, approaching the southern outskirts of Bautzen. Then, to make matters worse, Soviet reconnaissance units suddenly reported seeing 2 German infantry battalions, supported by tanks, approaching Bautzen from the east. It was clear to General Korchagin that the Soviet forces in Bautzen were about to be surrounded, and the general expected the full force of the German counterattack to fall on his troops by the morning of the 23rd of April. We can thus see that by the evening of the 22nd of April, a huge shift had happened in the Battle of Bautzen, with the Soviet forces assaulting the city now themselves under threat of encirclement from German forces quickly advancing on their position. This huge swing in the fortunes of the battle presented an immense challenge to the Soviet forces fighting in the city, and also to the Polish troops who were operating outside of Bautzen in support of the Soviet assault. The sudden appearance of strong German armoured forces, particularly on the northern approaches into Bautzen, led to chaotic scenes where Soviet and Polish troops had to abandon their positions and retreat under fire. In one such incident, in the village of Niederkainer to the north of Bautzen, a large group of German prisoners had been placed in a barn after having been captured during the previous days of fighting. With German forces now threatening to recapture the village, the Red Army soldiers who were guarding these prisoners doused the barn in petrol and set it alight. Sources suggest that up to 200 German prisoners, mostly members of the Volkssturm, were in the barn at the time, and that all of them were burnt alive. There is a huge controversy as to the exact identity of the perpetrators, with various sources claiming it was Polish troops responsible for the killings, whilst others claim it was Soviet soldiers. The exact details of this incident and who was responsible is therefore not clear. But what the killings at Niederkainer demonstrate nevertheless is that despite the end of the war being in sight, the horror and inhumanity of the fighting on the Eastern Front was showing no signs of slowing down. And as soon as German forces discovered the burnt-down barn, they retaliated in turn against the Soviet and Polish forces they came across. The Germans had already committed atrocities themselves, and would go on to commit many more, and there are reports that at numerous points in the fighting, when they captured Polish or Soviet field hospitals, the Germans would simply massacre the wounded enemy soldiers. This is reported to have happened in villages such as Guttau and Horka to the north of Bautzen, and even in Bautzen itself, with the death toll running into the hundreds. It was thus clear to all, no quarters would be given in the fighting, and when troops from either side tried to surrender, they were often just killed. The fight for Bautzen was therefore a fight to the death. In the early morning of the 23rd of April, General Maximov, still stationed in Weißenberg, radioed Soviet headquarters demanding urgent support, otherwise his encircled troops would be annihilated. He told them he was running out of ammunition, and he demanded to know when the promised Polish 1st Armoured Corps would arrive. Whilst Maximov was pleading to Soviet High Command for support, German forces captured the village of Gröditz on the western outskirts of Weißenberg, tightening the noose on Maximov's forces even further, and ramming home the message that they were trapped and alone. In an attempt to frustrate the advance of the German forces, the Soviet artillery battery at Neuperschwitz fired all of their rounds at the approaching German tanks, but the tanks kept on coming. The artillery gunners, recognizing their impending encirclement, spiked their guns and fled. By the evening of the 23rd, Soviet High Command contacted Maximov and ordered him to attempt to break out from Weißenberg to the closest Soviet positions. Meanwhile, on the 23rd, Ferdinand Schörner climbed into his Heinkel 111 at Gatow Airport to the west of Berlin, and he began his return flight back to the front line in Saxony. He had been summoned to Berlin by Hitler himself in order to receive his promotion to Field Marshal. He had promised the Führer during the ceremony that Bautzen would soon be freed by the German counterattack. However, despite Schörner's optimism, the situation still looked desperate for the Bautzen garrison, who were only just managing to resist the constant Soviet attacks on the Ortenburg castle. And they were doing this through a mixture of sheer will and determination. Time and time again, the Soviets demanded that they surrender, and every time the defenders refused. By now, the area under German control in the city had shrunk to little more than 150 square meters. But whilst the situation in the center hung by a knife edge, the German counterattack to liberate Bautzen was well underway in the outskirts. To the south of Bautzen, the 1st Hermann Göring Division and other supporting units marched on the city, where they were met by a group of Soviet T-34 tanks trying to block their advance near the village of Hochkirch. This German force, however, had more than 40 armoured vehicles in their convoy, including tanks and armoured personnel carriers, which more than matched the T-34s. After a few hours of heavy fighting, the Germans broke through and the assault force took the villages of Wyszka, Pielitz and Binowitz on the southeastern approach to Bautzen. By 3 p.m., this German force had reached the Goldene Höhe, a small hill at Rabitz in the southeast of Bautzen, and from this elevated position they could easily spot Soviet troops in the city below. They fired upon them, and they destroyed 8 to 10 anti-tank guns in the process. From here, the German tanks proceeded into Bautzen, and by the evening, as they made their way through the streets, they were joined by newly arrived Panzer Grenadiers providing much-needed infantry support to help the tanks advance further towards the centre. The Soviets targeted the southern German assault on Bautzen with an unrelenting wave of artillery fire, but despite causing numerous casualties, the Germans kept on coming. They refused to break off their assault, and the Panzer Grenadiers managed to overrun the Soviet artillery positions after brutal hand-to-hand fighting. The 20th Panzer Division, meanwhile, which was attacking Bautzen from the northeast, managed to capture Kreckwitz and Boak from the Soviets. The sudden appearance of highly motivated and battle-hardened German armoured units caused panic amongst the Polish Soviet troops, as up until now they had been fighting groups of young, inexperienced and poorly armed members of the Volkssturm. As this new wave of German infantry entered the streets of Bautzen, they engaged in bloody and intense fighting with the Soviet troops, who were now very much on the defensive. All corners of the city erupted with the sounds of gunfire, and key positions, such as the brewery close to the train station, became hotly contested, with ownership passing back and forth between the German and Soviet troops. The Germans now employed the same tactics that the Soviets had used in the days previous, meaning that once they found a strong Soviet defensive position, they chose to encircle it and cut it off from support, before grinding it down with grenades, Panzerfausts, and tank fire. Not all Soviet positions could be accounted for, though, as many Soviet troops retreated into the cellars of houses in order to strike at the backs of German troops once they passed through. This led to many Soviet groups becoming isolated and cut off from their main body of forces, and the task of flushing out these hidden Soviet pockets would take days. Soon, the Reichenturm at the Kornmarkt was taken by Panzer Grenadiers belonging to the 1st Hermann Göring Division, and not long after, the 20th Panzer Division was able to secure the Schützenplatz to the north of the centre as well, the advancing German infantry even managed to establish a bridgehead over the River Spree to the west of the city, and contact was re-established with the remaining men of the SS 10th Frundsberg Division who had evacuated from Bautzen before the bridges had blown. These troops were immediately incorporated into the attacking German forces and sent into the front line. The Soviets were shell-shocked by the speed of the German advance, and their troops besieging the remaining garrison at the Ortenburg Castle now found themselves under siege from the newly arrived German attacking forces. Scrambling to push back this rapid German onslaught, General Korchagin ordered the 24th Guards Mechanized Brigade to repel the German attackers. But before they could implement those orders, the Panzer Grenadiers of the 1st Hermann Göring Division surrounded the brigade's headquarters in the town hall. Soviet tanks were immediately sent to break the encirclement of the town hall and rescue the trapped Soviet troops. But as the tanks crossed the Kornmarkt on their way to the town hall, they were fired upon by a German Tiger tank and an assortment of Panzerfausts, stopping them in their tracks. In fact, any time the Soviets tried to cross the market, even with their wounded, they came under fire. Marshal Konev ordered General Korchagin to hold on to Bautzen at all costs, and the remaining Soviet forces in the city centre were told that only in extreme circumstances would they be allowed to pull out of the centre and retreat to the northern districts of Bautzen. Around noon on the 23rd, Luftwaffe fighter bombers swooped in to strafe and bomb the remaining Soviet positions in the centre, and as soon as this barrage ended, the German ground forces then followed up with a wave of artillery fire on the Soviets. The dazed and bloodied Soviet soldiers were then also met with a stream of German tanks, armoured personnel carriers, self-propelled guns, and waves of infantry who stormed into the centre and rushed the Soviet defensive positions. The Soviets fought hard to defend every inch of ground, and they used their own artillery firing from the Schafberg Hill to great effect, knocking out German tanks and obliterating German soldiers. House-to-house fighting ensued for hours, and the cinema changed hands numerous times. The Soviet infantry now used the city's medieval walls for their defense, and soldiers stood back to back, throwing grenades at the attacking Germans in a forlorn attempt to stop them from breaching the inner city. But at 4 p.m., the Germans launched another attack from the south, and it pushed back the 13th Guards Armoured Regiment, forcing them out of the centre and outwards to the outskirts of the city. The Soviets defending the centre were now left without any tank support, and by 5 p.m. the advance of the German infantry into the centre of Bautzen was unstoppable. Intense house-to-house fighting would continue throughout the evening of the 23rd, as the Germans now advanced street by street towards the remaining garrison troops defending the Ortenburg Castle. Whilst the German forces were clearly making progress in Bautzen, the wider German counterattack aiming to break north towards Spremberg was also gaining ground. In the east of Saxony, German forces, led by the 615th Division, continued pushing the Polish 7th Infantry Division back towards the banks of the Schwarze Schöps River. And by the end of the day, German forces had reached the towns of Weißwasser and Kreba as the Polish defences crumbled under repeated German attacks. In securing their new positions, the German forces in the area had managed to advance a further 20 kilometres in a single day, and they were now within striking distance of the town of Klitten. By now, the Germans had established a new line stretching from Kulm along the Schwarze Schöps River all of the way westwards towards the western outskirts of Bautzen. This represented a remarkable change in fortunes for the German forces in Saxony, who only a few days earlier had looked to be on the cusp of utter defeat after the initial shock and awe of the Polish-Soviet attack across the River Neisse. At 6 a.m. on the 24th of April, recognizing the futility of the Soviet position in Weißenberg, General Maximov ordered the 294th Rifle Division along with his supporting battle group force, to break out to the nearest Soviet lines north of Diza. The Germans saw that the Soviets were making a breakout attempt, so the Brandenburg Division, which had been ordered to bottle up the Soviets and prevent their escape, ordered a series of artillery barrages to rain down on them as they tried leaving the town. In this barrage, most of the Soviet tanks and armoured vehicles were wiped out, and the remaining infantry attempted to run through the shelling and reach the cover of the nearby forest. Some soldiers did manage to reach the tree line, only to find themselves encircled once again by waiting German forces. Realizing the hopelessness of their situation, Maximov ordered his surviving troops to break off into small groups, or even just individuals, and attempt to reach the safety of Soviet lines. The remaining troops dropped all of their heavy equipment and ran for their lives. But to no avail. Most were either killed outright by the Germans or taken prisoner. And in the end, less than 1/3 of the Soviet troops who broke out of Weißenberg would manage to reach Soviet lines. When these bloodied survivors arrived, they were immediately amalgamated into other units, given how few had survived the ordeal. The 294th Rifle Division had been effectively wiped out. 2 brigade commanders had been killed, and even General Maximov himself had been injured by a grenade blast. He was taken prisoner by the Germans and transferred to a POW camp in Zittau, where both of his legs were amputated. During the Soviet offensive in Prague, in May, he was freed from the camp, but he died soon after from his wounds. With Weißenberg now empty of Soviet troops, the Brandenburg Division advanced into the town, and by 2:30 in the afternoon, they had reached the train line west of the town. With their task complete, the Brandenburg Division was transferred to the Bautzen area to help assist with the final capture of the city. Overall, it's estimated that 3,000 Soviet troops were killed in the elimination of the Weißenberg pocket, with only 216 Germans killed in return. The Germans reveled in their victory, and the destruction of the 294th Rifle Division was made even sweeter by the Aladdin's cave worth of equipment which the Germans captured from the Soviets, including 1,500 vehicles of all types. Many of these vehicles were US-built jeeps and trucks which had been given to the Soviets as part of the Allied loan agreement. In Bautzen, meanwhile, shortly after 5 a.m. on the morning of the 24th of April, a scout party from the 20th Panzer Division, led by the commanding General Oppoln Bronichowski himself, managed to slip through the Soviet lines outside of the Ortenburg Castle, and he made contact with the German defenders inside. Oppoln Bronichowski expected to find 1,200 men waiting for him, but instead, he was met by a battered and bloodied group of only 400 men. For the past 3 days, the defenders had held out within the grounds of the castle, and the tattered group of Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and wounded soldiers had managed to repel wave after wave of attacks from elite Soviet armoured elements and battle-hardened infantry. Albert Giebner, a member of the Bautzen garrison, tells of the moment the counterattacking German troops linked up with the defenders of the castle. We had known since the 21st of April that German troops were on the march from outside of Bautzen on their way to relieve us. For 3 days, this thought increased our defences. But in the meantime, whilst no one came to our aid, the ring became tighter and tighter. Suddenly, on the 24th of April, when the Russians were already banging on the doors of our defences, we heard firm footsteps. Was it the enemy or a comrade? Someone said, "Mensch, latsch mir nicht auf die Beine." Don't get in my way. So that could only have come from Germans. To my delight, it was German infantry, and the tanks followed. We were free, and I was able to report that German troops had arrived. The link-up between the defenders and the German attacking forces naturally led to an outbreak of euphoria, though the mood quickly soured when the troops of the 1st Hungarian Division and 20th Panzer Divisions realized that so many civilians still remained in the city. The German counter-attacking forces had been under the impression that the people of Bautzen had been completely evacuated, and they demanded to know why this wasn't the case. History doesn't recall Commander Hupke's response. After celebrating the link-up, General Oppon Bronichowski of the 20th Panzer Division immediately integrated the Bautzen garrison into his forces. And mindful of the diminishing stocks of fighting men available to the Wehrmacht at this time, Oppon Bronichowski also reviewed the death sentences which had been passed on supposed deserters and cowards who had shirked in their defense of the city. He commuted these sentences, obliging the condemned men to continue fighting in the front line instead. He then divided his resources and ordered the Bautzen garrison to wipe out remaining pockets of Soviet resistance in the city, supporting them with guns and ammo for the task, whilst his 20th Panzer Division organized new defenses in case the Soviets launched a counterattack to retake Bautzen. At 12 p.m. on the 24th of April, the Red Army Air Force finally showed up, and 30 bombers targeted German positions around Bautzen. But this failed to turn the tide. And by the afternoon, General Korchagin, fearing an imminent collapse of his remaining Soviet forces in the city centre, ordered a full retreat of those forces to the northern suburbs, in direct violation of Konev's order to hold Bautzen at all costs. An undermanned mine-laying engineer company of around 65 men was ordered to cover their retreat. This heavily depleted unit was armed with machine guns, but most of the ammunition belts were half empty, and there were only a handful of grenades to go around. One tank was left for support, but its gun had stopped working. However, despite the odds, this plucky group positioned itself on the first and second floor of the courthouse on Lessingstrasse. Their orders? To pin down the Germans and allow for as many Soviet troops as possible to retreat to the northern districts. At 5 p.m., the Germans attacked the courthouse, but the Soviet defenders held off the assault. The Germans were in no mood to stick around, however, so they simply surrounded the building and continued their attack northwards, chasing the retreating Soviet forces. After holding out for hours, at 9 p.m., the remaining Soviet troops in the courthouse made a breakout from their position, and 7 riflemen sitting atop their one tank stormed through the German lines, shooting at anything that moved. The rest of the surviving defenders split up into small groups, and they slipped out into the side streets. In the end, only 4 men from this company managed to escape and actually reach Soviet lines north of the city. With their retreat from the city centre, the only areas still under Soviet control were in the southwest and southeast of Bautzen, with the brewery once again seeing heavy fighting, and ownership of the brewery changed 5 times alone that day. Heavy fighting also took place on the Outer Lauenstrasse, where German infantry, supported by 30 tanks and 50 armoured vehicles, overcame pockets of stubborn Soviet resistance. In the evening, the Soviets tried to wrestle back control of Bautzen by launching a counterattack from the north, consisting of 20 Soviet tanks and assault guns supported by infantry. However, this counterattack was repelled with ease by the jubilant German forces, who were now buoyed by their success in recapturing Bautzen. Meanwhile, the newly arrived Polish 1st Armoured Corps, supported by the Polish 8th Infantry Division, were also ordered to launch a counterattack on Bautzen in a bid to dislodge the Germans. The Polish 1st Armoured Corps, striking at dusk, advanced towards Bautzen from the west, along the road towards the district of Stibitz. but they soon ran headfirst into the massed defense lines of the 1st Hermann Göring Division, supported by the SS 10th Frundsberg Division. In the subsequent fighting, 17 Polish tanks were destroyed, with 120 Polish troops wounded and 42 killed. The Germans repulsed the Polish tanks, and they pushed them back to their starting points at the villages of Salzenforst and Bolbritz, 6 kilometers to the northwest of Bautzen. In theory, this Polish attack should have been more successful, as the German troops positioned on the western outskirts of Bautzen possessed little in the way of anti-tank guns. However, once again, the inexperience of the Polish troops was the deciding factor in the fight, as their attacks were conducted too hastily and the tanks went charging in without sufficient infantry and artillery support. With the failure of the Polish tanks to break through to Bautzen, the remaining pockets of Soviet troops hiding in fortified cellars and houses throughout the city were doomed. Due to the poor state of communications, many of these troops had not even received the order to retreat to the north of the city, whilst others were pinned down by German troops and simply couldn't fall back. These disparate groups formed nests of resistance, which would fight on doggedly for the next few days, but eventually they would all be wiped out. By the evening of the 24th of April, the Polish and Soviets knew that Bautzen was finally lost. And rather than committing more troops in a fruitless effort to retake the city, they instead focused on re-establishing their defense lines elsewhere in Saxony in order to prevent further German advances. For the Wehrmacht, the city had been quote-unquote saved, but in truth, Bautzen lay in ruins. With the relief of Bautzen and the destruction of Soviet forces in Weißenberg, the Germans had achieved key victories on the 24th of April. But they couldn't savour their victories for long, as they immediately embarked on the next stage in their counterattack, a continued advance northwards towards the town of Spremberg in southern Brandenburg. The Germans thus shifted their focus to the area northeast of Bautzen, and they launched an attack on a mixed Polish-Soviet tank force trying to maintain a strong defensive line between the villages of Burg and Kreckwitz. The defense failed, and at least 2/3 of the Polish tanks were destroyed. Once again, the sources speak of how the inexperienced Polish tank crews failed to maintain a maneuverable formation, and they often left their tanks in static formations. Their tanks were thus sitting ducks, which the Germans were able to pick off with ease. Meanwhile, the Polish positions at the villages of Großwelka and Kleinwelka to the north of Bautzen quickly became untenable, and due to diminishing ammunition and fuel supplies, their forces had to retreat further north to the villages of Schmochtitz and Strohschutz in order to not overextend their lines. And as if things couldn't get any worse for the Poles, a reconnaissance unit from the Hermann Göring Division launched an ambush on the general staff of the Polish Second Army positioned in the village of Bloerschutz, 5 kilometers west of Bautzen. After the fighting had ended, German soldiers picked through the bodies of the Polish dead. And on one, they found orders outlining the retreat of the Polish 9th Infantry Division, which had been valiantly leading a solitary charge onto Dresden. Now, it was certainly the right decision to have the Polish 9th Infantry Division break off their assault on Dresden and head back east to strengthen the line against further German counterattacks. However, it was no longer safe for the 9th Infantry Division to actually retreat, because by now, German forces were occupying the entire area between Dresden and the area north of Bautzen, where the rest of the Polish-Soviet forces were positioned. The Germans, armed with this crucial piece of intelligence, therefore started planning a deadly ambush for the Polish 9th Infantry Division as it passed through German-held territory on their march back east.